It's really scary and really dangerous to try to adapt training methods that the best in the world are doing, because one of the reasons they're best in the world is they're freaky. Their physiology is not normal, and probably their whole life is not normal.
This is Andrew Vance, and you're listening to Choose the Hard Way, the show about how hard things build stronger humans who have more fun. If you're watching, I look a little different today, and that's because I have cancer. I just completed round 2 of chemo for B-cell lymphoma. I want to thank everyone in the Choose the Hard Way community for your support and your positivity as I move towards being fully cured. I'm sharing more about my experience with cancer at Hardway Pod on Instagram and on the Choose the Hard Way Substack. That's at alwaysthehardway.substack.com. You can also find that link in the show notes and on my Instagram in the link tree at Hardway Pod. And I'll be doing an episode about my experience with cancer soon as well. Right now, though, my guest is Dr. Stephen Seiler. From the New York Times to the podcasts of Andrew Huberman, Peter Attia, Rhonda Patrick, and so many others, including Joe Rogan, Zone 2 and VO2 Max protocols have really become this cultural obsession for anyone who's interested in health, wellness, and longevity. Stephen Seiler coined the term polarized training, and he's the person who systematized the body of knowledge and research underlying basically everything that you've read about Zone 2, VO2 Max, and polarized training, and that everyone is talking about, and that health and wellness influencers often get completely wrong. I'm on the Fast Talk Labs advisory board with Stephen, and I thought it would be fun to hear directly from him how he thinks about polarized training, its application for masters athletes versus world tour riders like Tour de France winner Tadej Pogacar and everyone else in the world tour who is using this polarized approach, as well as in the sport of triathlon with athletes like Kristian Blummenfelt and so many others. And I thought it would be really fun to hear about Stephen's emergent research into the relationship between breathing, training zones, and its application in real life. A heads up, there is a part 2 of this interview that's coming soon. I have people who haven't been racing bikes and running their entire life, who are my close friends, and also who just reach out to me all the time, who've heard something Huberman said, or they've read Attia's book, Outlive, which does contain a lot of useful information. And they're asking for advice about how to do Zone 2 and VO2 Max workouts, aka polarized training. For part 2 of this interview, again, coming soon, I invited Stephen back, and I had my good friend Shannon Jones on, who is a 2-sport Division I athlete, now my age. He's 50, and he's figuring out, hey, what do I actually do to get the most out of Zone 2 VO2 Max, and how should I be thinking about this? So we do a bit of a case study and a live analysis with Stephen, which I really enjoyed, and I think you'll dig too. That's coming soon. Wherever you're listening, please hit 5 stars and subscribe to Choose the Hard Way. And to support this work, please become a paid subscriber to the Choose the Hard Way Substack. Again, that link's at Hardway Pod on Instagram. It's in the show notes. You can always go direct at alwaysthehardway.substack.com. That Substack is where I write essays and share my thoughts about episodes from the Choose the Hard Way podcast, as well as my cancer experience and family, bike racing, Zen life, the world tour, the Giro. I cover it all. With over $1 trillion in transactions to date, blockchain.com is your trusted partner on your crypto journey, and they are our close partner here on Choose the Hard Way. You can go to blockchain.com to get started today. No experience required. I can't ride right now, but I'm really looking forward to riding my Lauf Uthold, Sigla, and Elia, and hopefully getting over to do Lauf's mountain bike stage race in 2027. A huge thank you to blockchain.com and to Lauf for being supporters of the show. You can check Lauf out at laufcycles.com. They're fun, they're cool, they're elegant products, and they just work better than everything else. You can find me on Instagram at HardwayPod, and you can follow Steven Seiler on X at Steven Seiler, link in show notes.
But my first transport vehicle was a big wheel. I don't know if you remember the big wheel. I think big wheel came along in about 69, but I probably had it at age 5 or so. So it would have been around the 70 model.
Yeah.
With the peg where you could adjust the blue back and then the yellow, because it was blue, yellow, and red, right? Anyway, so that was the first, was a big wheel. And then came the green, I have to assume it was a Schwinn. And I just called it with the banana seat, and you kind of felt like you were on a chopper. So that was my bike at age, say, 7. Yeah.
Nice.
6,
yeah. I may have had the same one, because my Schwinn also was green, and then it had like a sparkly white or translucent seat, and it had the chopper bars as well.
Exactly. The seat had these sparkles.
Yeah,
that's right. And I'm pretty sure I got rid of the little tassels on the side, because that was girly or whatever.
Yeah, of course. You couldn't be seen in the neighborhood with those. Yeah, I still have that bike. It's in my parents' garage, and before I had that, my cousins had it, so it was a hand-me-down bike, and they're probably, I guess, how old are those cousins? They're probably 55, 57, something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. 50.
Yeah.
You're 50. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're 10 years younger than me. So, yeah. So that was transport, and the way it was back then, in the generation that I grew up in, the parents basically just threw us out, just said, get out of the apartment at that time, and then we'd come back occasionally, come back for lunch, come back for dinner. But otherwise, I wasn't allowed in the house, so I was just constantly running around finding stuff to do.
Yeah, that was how my upbringing was as well. Just a lot of time outside, especially in the summer, just not a lot of time with the video games or anything like that.
Video games, I don't even know. I don't think those existed until I was a teenager.
Yeah, maybe Pong, right?
Pong was my first. I was at a sports camp, and I remember playing Pong, and that was the first, like, oh, wow, this is interesting, and then came pretty quickly, it developed, and when I was like 15, 16, and I could drive, then we had this place that we could go, and it had the arcade. It was the Bull, what was it called? The Bull something. Anyway, there was a mechanical bull there. But what really became popular was the arcade. And that's where Space Invaders and Centipede and Frogger and all this stuff was. And I was pretty good at those kinds of games. They were 2-dimensional. You could break the code of the game. And then once you had the code figured out, then you could go a long time. And so that's what I grew up with. My son grew up with more of the 3-dimensional kind of having to be able to imagine where in space he was. And I still suck at those games. I don't even like them. I like the really fast paced, short in and out, and so, but that kind of gaming was early days when I was a teenager.
We recently got our kids an original Nintendo. It must be a reissue of the original Nintendo.
Yeah.
And, they're on a screen, but ironically, it's so much less stimulating than something like Minecraft or other things that kids do on screens now. So it's almost a slower pace of interacting with the screen than what kids typically are doing these days. So it's a much lower degree of stimulation, but it's funny to walk in the room. I was telling my son this morning, because he's always hopping around between different games. I said, hey, when I was a kid, I guess I'm at that phase of my life where I'm making statements like that now.
Yeah. Everything was better back then,
Well, no, I told him, I was like, hey, I might have 2 or 3 games, and then you'd have to wait 4 or 5 months, save up your money if you wanted to get another cartridge. You weren't just, you didn't have 50 games to play every day. Right. And then it's like, oh, wow.
Well,
that's really
I think we
interesting.
like to convince ourselves things were harder back then. And in some ways, I think they were, in the sense that it was more primitive. You had to entertain yourself. You had to struggle with boredom, or deal with boredom. And I think through boredom came creativity. At least for me, it did. My starting point in science was just that traipsing around in the woods and thinking it was kind of interesting what I was finding. And then eventually I lived under the stairs in a way because my parents gave me the closet under the stairs and let me build my laboratory. And I'm making air quotes here for those who are listening. And then I slowly collected microscopes and beakers and test tubes and chemistry set and all this stuff. And so that's where I started goofing around with science, or kind of something that was science adjacent as a 10-year-old. And then it went from there. And at the same time, I was in school sports. And so I lived in this bifurcated life where I loved being a science geek and talking with the nerds at school. And then I also was an athlete and was pretty decent. And so but I just didn't see those two worlds as compatible. They were just separate in my life. Until until I read a certain book, and I put them together.
What book did you read?
It was a book by James Fix was his name. He wrote a book, The Complete Runner. And I read it, and James Fix died of a heart attack, unfortunately. But the thesis of his book was basically that if you ran, a lot, you were essentially protected from heart attacks. Yeah, it turned out not to be so true. But there was a chapter in that book, and it was, I want to say it was chapter 17, towards the end of the book. And the title of the chapter was The Scientists of Sport. And so suddenly, even in that title, I thought, science and sport in the same title? And so I read it, and right then I said, oh, this is what I'm doing. And I was 15, I guess.
What did you love about it?
Just, I don't know. It brought together the two worlds that I thought were incompatible. That I could be geeky and athletic at the same time. And so to this day, I would say that's kind of where I still am, is I'm geeky. So as you can imagine, but I still love training. I still love, I have a cycling room upstairs. I still like competing, both with myself and with others, but maybe even more with myself now. Back then it was with others, but the biggest reward for me at my age now is just getting inside my own head, battling with myself.
It's interesting when I think about being a young person around that age, 15, 16, at that time, I was playing in a punk rock band, the Larry Jones Experience. I was very into writing. I was interested in journalism. I wanted to be a novelist. And I also loved riding my bike. And I ran cross country, but I was absolutely terrible at it. I was a terrible, terrible runner. And I was a tall, skinny kid. So everybody thought, Andrew, you should be great at this. Like, what's wrong with you? And I really just wasn't that physically developed at the time. I was just a tall, skinny kid. But the expectation was, well, you should be winning the races. And instead, I'd be in last place. But my concept at the time, similar to what you're describing, I thought, well, you can't really be someone who's in a punk rock band and be a good athlete and be a writer. These are really different things. I just imagine people in the punk rock bands that I liked, like bands like Fugazi, people like Ian MacKaye. I was like, they're just all in, they're living this. And then as an adult, as I read more about the lives of people like Ian Mackay or Henry Rollins or others, they were very well-rounded athletic people. They were intellectual, and they were playing this music. And I was thinking about this morning when I was reflecting on research I'd done preparing to speak to you. And I was thinking about just lateral thinking and systems thinking in particular. And when we think about polarized training, for example, which is, it's Pareto's law, right? Like it's 80-20. And then I started thinking about, well, this is very interesting. I wonder what other systems in nature generally where this is actually a foundational principle.
Well, I mean, now you're already going into some weeds that I find fascinating, but you have to almost go farther, because the 80-20 where, that I kind of put out there back 20 something years ago, I said, look, these elite endurance athletes aren't training hard every day. They are training about 80% of their sessions are what we would call low intensity, green zone, talking pace, doing the miles and so forth. And then about 20% are harder, threshold plus. And at the time I called it polarized because at least in rowing and cross country skiing, where I had the best data available internationally, they were truly training quite polarized. They were not doing very much in the so-called threshold zone. They were either, doing low and long, or they were doing intervals, preparing, because their races were so, in rowing, it's a 6-minute race, and it made sense that it was quite polarized. But fast forward to today, I think the question then, or for the last 20 years, I've been trying to figure out, well, okay, I know what they're doing, and it seems to be quite universal in the sense that these different sporting groups, cross-country skiing and cycling and running and rowing, have all converged on basically the same model, independent of each other. They found that they weren't talking to each other, the cyclists and the rowers, but they ended up doing the same thing from a training intensity distribution point of view. So then the question for me became, okay, this is a self-organizing property, meaning something about our bodies, our genetics, our biology is creating the conditions that make this the right solution. Yeah. And so then the question has been, well, yeah, okay, what? And I, early days in like 2004, 2006, I just proposed some things around signaling. But more recently, the molecular signaling has become much more advanced. And then by accident, I found this so-called bow tie architecture. And I think I fell into it looking at something else. It was risk management or something. But the bow tie architecture is a biological concept, and it says that you have the body, there's multiple inputs that the body has our biology has kind of co-opted some of the signals that happen during exercise, during the metabolism. And these metabolic signals include things like calcium increasing inside the cell, that's a function of recruitment, things like mechanical stress, like these so-called reactive oxygen species, free radicals some of you have heard of. You take vitamin C to prevent those from becoming excessive, and the energy charge of the cell. But these all turn on a central kind of regulator, or a few central regulators, hence the idea of the bow tie. Lots of inputs in to a central knot, like the knot in the bow tie, and then a cascade of adaptive responses out. Now, if I were going to describe this a different way, I'd say, what about all the imaginable thoughts you can have up in your head? The color red, love, Dallas Cowboys football team, all these different things can all be expressed with 26 letters of the alphabet, right? And generated into however many hundreds of thousands of words that are in the English language. The count varies depending on who you ask, but you get the idea that lots and lots of thoughts, central, a few intermediates, and then a cascade of outputs. Same idea. That's the idea of the bow tie architecture. Well, that's what we're seeing in biology and in the response to training. And if you first know that, then I think the way I try to describe it is I think that training zones, you're not trying to use training zones to precisely regulate adaptations because they all turn on the same signals. A hard interval session, a long endurance session can turn on the same signals for adaptation. So what are we regulating? What are we managing? Stress.
Right.
We're managing the systemic level stress responses that come along with those training sessions.
Right.
And some kinds of training sessions are more stressful than others. Particularly the high intensity signals, the high intensity sessions, whether it's a long threshold session or an intense interval session, they turn on that autonomic nervous system response. They turn on a fight or flight response. And that's good. That's part of our survival. That's part of what has helped us to survive and thrive as humans, is that we had the fight or flight response. But if you turn it on every day, it does damage. That's because we've got this clock, this biological clock that we're all dealing with. What is it? It's 24 hours. We've got this rhythm, this circadian rhythm, which basically says that if whatever this process that we're doing as athletes is going to be sustainable, or basically as humans, we have to kind of come back to baseline every 24 hours on average. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And obviously, there are dozens, if not hundreds of hours of podcasts, of videos, there are books written about your research. There's so much out there with your thinking around polarized training, increasingly your research and thinking around the relationship between breathing, intensity, training zones. And a lot of it is often talked about within the context of professional athletes, world tour athletes who are dedicating every second of their life, who have a support staff that are helping to enable this. And an aspect of this, as you mentioned, stress in particular. And I think about myself as a master's athlete and many people out there who I think are seeking out information about training and in particular digging into your research. I don't know that they're always considering it within the context of their allostatic load. And there are a number of other factors as well that I would love to discuss today. But how do you think about the applicability of your research and training methodologies that are derived from it, that often are from elite sport, as they are then transposed into the high stress life of someone who is not a professional athlete?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's an important question, and that is that, look, I'll go back. I'll go to an immediate analogy. Formula One. I don't know how many people out there listening watch or are aware of the Formula One circuit. It is an innovation arena. It is extremely expensive. These various car companies are sponsoring these Formula One cars in this circus. It's a circus that moves around all over the world on very dedicated arenas that are technically just optimized to pull in data from the car and from the driver. 300 different variables. And all of this is, you think, well, is this just entertainment? Is Toyota and Red Bull and all these, are they all doing this for entertainment purposes? No. These car companies, Red Bull's not a car company, but you get my, whether it's Mercedes or whoever, they're not doing this because they want to entertain the masses. They're doing this because it is an innovation arena. And just as one example, the Formula One, if you've ever seen the steering wheel on a Formula One car, it, number one, it comes out of the car to help the driver squeeze themselves into, because the car is so narrow. And the reason the steering wheel now has about 50 different buttons on it is because they had to move a lot of those control functions up from the cockpit and put them on the wheel to save space, to improve aerodynamics of the car. But what did they find out? They said, you know what? We can put some of these same buttons on the family Ford or the family Mercedes or the family BMW. And so there's a trickle down effect of these high performance innovation environments, because they are under some really severe constraints and they've got to get it right. And if they get it right, it turns out it does scale down. All right, so now let's go to humans. Let's go to those elite athletes. Look, to be honest, when Jonas Vingegaard is at a training camp up in the mountains, his life is simplified. It's eat, train, sleep, repeat. His team is doing everything they can to eliminate sources of stress. Now, he doesn't like being away from his family, so that's a problem for him, and it will probably result in him retiring early. But the training camp effect is you literally take away a lot of the issues, and you try to really allow the athlete to focus in on the training. And then you ask the question, okay, given that, how do they optimize? Right? They've got to solve this and make a sustainable process. And what we find is that we can learn from them, and it trickles down. The opposite is not true. That is to say that you can't take the family Ford and tweak it and get a Formula One car. You got me? It doesn't work. And you can't take an 8-week training study of a sofa sitter that does intervals or threshold training for 8 weeks and they get better. They absolutely will. In fact, they'll get better just about doing anything. If they're out of shape, if they're untrained, you can do anything and you're going to get better. But the problem is that doesn't scale. And once you get past 8 weeks and you say, well, okay, what are you going to do the next 8 weeks? What are you going to do the next 8 weeks? And then they go, well, we just keep doing what we've been doing. Well, you stagnate. And the elite athletes have figured that out. And so is what we know from them applicable? Absolutely. But does the average Joe, the average Steven Seiler, do we have to take into account life stress? Heck yeah. In fact, I can tell you a story right now. As I speak to you, as you listen to me now, I have atrial fibrillation. I have an active atrial fib. It started yesterday. I'm going to end up probably having to go to the hospital and do what's called an electrical conversion. They're going to have to shock me and restart me and get me back in rhythm. So that's life for me. Is unfortunately at 60, I've had some arrhythmias for a while. They were gone for 10 years. Now they've come back. And why did they come back? Was it because of my training? I don't think so, because I was training. I was hitting max heart rate on Zwift and wasn't a problem. I was feeling great for years. But last fall, I said yes to too much. I said yes to too many international trips, to invited lectures and keynote this and keynote that. And at the same time, I was trying to jump into high rocks with my daughter, and I was changing my training, and it all added up to a perfect storm of a bad combination. And I started having these fibrillation episodes. So I'm acutely sensitive to this reality of the allostatic load, or the life load. Let's just call it the life load that we all have. I have it too. And it is often, it's that combination of challenges that pushes us into where we get sick or we stagnate and so forth. So, boy, I tell you what, I felt it on my body, that reality.
And I also have AFib, and long story, As I tried to chase down what was happening and what was the course of action for me over the course of about a decade ago, doing an investigation. I ended up at Stanford eventually with their head of cardiac EP. Thank goodness I saw him, because I also saw one of the top cardiac EPs at UCSF. I walked in, his PA came into the room prior to the appointment. She said, "Hey, just to let you know, he's going to tell you have to have an ablation and you should go get a second opinion." and I thought, I was like, okay, thanks for the heads up. I thought that's kind of odd that this person is telling me that, who works for this surgeon. Surgeon came in, he said, okay, looked at my chart, my Zeo patch data. Yes, you have AFib, you had these long episodes. Let's schedule the ablation. And then I pumped the brakes. I went and saw and talked to a lot of other people. Again, I ended up at Stanford, head of cardiac EP there. It took months to get in. Walks in the room, sits down, and just talks to me for about 20 minutes. Where we landed, he just asked me, what's going on in your life, basically. And at that time, I had gotten married, I'd had my first kid, and I bought my first house, and I'd started a new job within 10 months. And he said, okay, he said, why don't you see what you can do to downregulate your stress? Easier said than done, of course, and come back and see me in 6 months, and then we'll see what we do next. Since then, I have had episodes of AFib. Thankfully for me, I've never had tachycardia, which I think would be really terrifying. I've had kind of micro tachycardia as part of my AFib, but never up into the 200s, 250s, right. Nothing like that. And so I've learned to kind of manage it through lifestyle factors. But Stephen, there's so many people like yourself, like me, long training histories, who experience AFib. And I think that introduces this conversation, not just around life load and stress management, but like this question of, hey, is this actually healthy? What do you think?
Yeah, we were having this discussion because I may end up having to go down the ablation route. We'll see, because I've had this for a while, but I had this low frequency form of AFib that I was able to bring myself out of it with just like almost a ramp protocol out in the woods and slowly increase the pace because I had this low frequency, but it's not working now. So something has changed, and obviously I've gotten older, and so we'll see where I end up. I'm like you. I would much prefer a lifestyle-based solution, that right. I just get my act together. But we'll see where it goes. But it appears to be almost an epidemic. It appears to be mostly among men, mostly among so-called mammals. Middle-aged men in Lycra. We've even had this discussion about that. It seems maybe to be exacerbated by cycling, by the popularity of cycling, and also in Norway we have cross-country skiing where we see some of the same. And what's different about those sports compared to kind of the primary movement modality of humans, running? What is different? Well, running is kind of self-limiting because of the mechanical load. You can't do the endless interval sessions. You don't do 5-hour runs, right? Because it tends to goes against itself. You just break down your body. So there's a self-limiting component to it that we take away with cycling, because cycling doesn't have any ballistic loading, doesn't have any eccentric loading. And we can just do it and do it and do it, And so we're starting to develop this push towards pretty darn high volumes, even in recreational age groupers.
30 or 40 hours a week, or you're not a mid-pack racer.
I mean, some of them are just going nuts. And so they're also training hard. They're doing the 4x4s and all these, everybody's looking for the epic workout. And it's a sad state of affairs. And unfortunately, sports scientists have contributed to it. For partly the same reasons, is that if you're going to do a study in a laboratory, it's pretty darn boring to study 2-hour runs, or 5-hour rides on a bike. You don't see much of that research in the laboratory. What do you see? You see interval sessions. You see research on the newest interval protocol, 40-20s, 30-15s, 4x8, 4x4, whatever it might be, always looking for the interval session. So we in this my ecosystem, we've contributed to this through our own, I don't know, partly time pressure, needing to get studies done, partly laziness, and partly our joy of watching people suffer, but that, and when we go into YouTube, what do you see? You see an echo chamber of discussion around the latest interval session, the latest double thresholds, or whatever it might be, right? And this is driving some unhealthy behaviors, I would say. Because endurance training is long game.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Even in ultra running, for example, where they're definitely running longer than 5 hours, right? Like we have people now, there's the Moab 240, even a race like the Leadville 100. I mean, think about how long they're out there. I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's maybe, I should look it up. It's like 15 hours maybe or much longer for the average person. But David Roach, who holds the Leadville fastest time, and many other ultra runners, what are they doing now to increase their training load while avoiding injury from all the eccentric and loaded movement that they do, because it does break your body down? Well, they're getting on Zwift. And then for the durability component, they're lifting heavy weights, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the cheat code, so that when they hit the competition that's 10 to 15 hours, they're not broken from the training. This then is making me think about breathing and muscle tension. And if we think about this in relation to three things, one, in relation to AFib, I have had a gravel pro on this show, Chase Wark. He's talked publicly about, I think he's 24 or 25, maybe he's a bit older than that. But, he's doing those 30, 40-hour weeks consistently, started to have really frequent AFib problems. I don't know how I had never come across this, but he shared with me this method called the bearing down method. This is not medical advice. Don't try this. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Stephen. But you
there's some visions that are coming to my head, but I'm not going to say what that.
Yeah. So basically, it's squeezing it's like the Valsalva maneuver, where you're creating enterothoracic pressure, similar to if you were about to go to the bathroom. And
that's the visual I was having.
Yeah, you get off the bike and do this, and it actually can make the AFib episode subside. So he's actually used this in competition, and that's Chase's story to tell. I'd never heard this. I tried it when I had an AFib episode while riding Zwift in my garage over the winter. It did work, but what it made me think about, and I would love to, in a moment here, get into the relationship between breathing and what it can tell us about training zones. But if we think about the other side of the equation, with how do you reduce that life load or allostatic load, all the stress other than what you're doing on the bike or in your primary sport, Stephen, how do you think about the role of breath and of muscle tension in relation to stress generally?
Yeah, this is I'm in the last few years, I've rediscovered, or maybe really discovered for the first time, my lungs and breathing. As a physiology student, we were taught that basically the lungs are overdimensioned for exercise, and as long as you don't have asthma or you lose a lung or what, then you don't need to worry about breathing. Breathing takes care of itself. That was kind of the zeitgeist. And so we focused on the heart, and we focused on lactate and other things. And breathing was just we needed to measure the breathing to get at VO2 max and so forth. So that was the kind of the state of affairs for me 30, 40 years ago, learning the basics of exercise physiology. I think that has changed and is changing. And we are starting to look at some of these ancient truths around, or ancient methods of breathing from other cultures. They've come into our way of thinking, whether it's box breathing, different modalities of breath control. And we're finding, I in my own research, I can tell a little story. I'm a Zwifter, not a Zwifty, not a Swifty, but a Zwifter. And so I've put in 2,300 plus hours on Zwift. So I kind of know that ecosystem. And it's a wonderful laboratory in a way for a geek like me. So I have tested so many technologies up in the comfort of my cycling room, of NIRS and EMG, and even like thermal cameras, and looking at trying to see my skin blood flow. And if you can think of it, I've tried it up in that darn. But heart rate is obviously always there. Power is always there. And I started trying to get at, I want to know more about that internal change in the load, the cost of doing that interval session or doing that threshold workout. Because we all know how it feels. Let's take some standard workout like 4 times 8 minutes, with 2-minute recovery. And the first 8 minutes feels pretty good. You're under control, right? You're comfortably uncomfortable, but you're working, and your perceived exertion is hard, but not super hard, and so forth. And then comes number 2, and number 2 might feel even a little bit better, because it was like that first interval was the last warm up. And so you peak out, you're feeling your best in that second of those 4 8-minute intervals. But then things change. And then you feel it. You're starting to really, that third one, you're starting to say, I'm looking forward to this being over. And by the fourth one, you are breathing out your ears. You are counting seconds. You with me? We've all done this. And so the point is that 4 by 8, the first 8, the second 8, the third 8, and the fourth 8, they're all different. There's an evolution of that workout, and we get used to it. We learn how to deal with it, but heart rate doesn't tell the story. Heart rate does drift up, but it tends to flatten out. But then or we could take another example like 40-20s or 30-15 workouts. 3. What's a typical 3 times 13 minutes of 30-15s or something like that. The Runestad workout.
Yeah, horrible.
Horrible workout. Yeah, it's brutal.
Makes you fast.
What happens?
Yeah.
Your heart rate flattens out. It quasi stabilizes, right? So that between the third and the different blocks, the heart rate's not changing very much, and it kind of zeroes in around 90%. Yeah.
Yeah.
88, 89, 90%, but it's sure not quasi stable up in your head. You're having to mobilize more and more. And so I was like, well, doggone it, heart rate's not telling me the truth, because when I listen to myself, I'm breathing out my ears by the end of this. And I said, I wish I could measure that. Right? And so that was the start of this process for me of trying to figure out, well, how do we measure breathing out in the field? How would we? And so I got connected to a company that's trying to develop the same technology. Of course, there's been some will tell you that you can get it from your your heart watch. That's true. Maybe at rest and maybe at low intensity, but the part of the signal that you need to capture the breathing, it disappears at high intensity. So it's kind of it's a dead on arrival to think that you're going to really get accurate breathing data from the heart rate signal at high intensities. It just doesn't work. If we know our physiology, we know that it shouldn't work because of the sympathetic parasympathetic balance and how it changes.
It's almost a lagging indicator of a lagging indicator. So it would be like a third order metric almost,
it's
right?
doomed.
Yeah.
And basically, the only way to transfer in a laboratory, you can measure breathing about 50 different ways. You can use acoustic measurements, temperatures, you can do all kinds of stuff to capture that breathing signal and capture frequency. But as soon as you go out in the noisy world of real training, most of these methods fall apart. And the one that we've been investigating is just look at the thorax, the torso, and the stretch that happens when you breathe, and capturing that with soft stretch sensors, and then having to deal with the filtering and all the issues around signal to noise, which is it's always comes down to in technology development types of issues is signal. How much can you capture the signal? And how much noise? And does the noise drown out the signal? And if not, how do you deal with it? Right? So that's kind of a basic truth in all of these different wearable technologies. It's just can you get the signal to noise ratio at an acceptable level? And that's where we're at with breathing. And for running, the answer is got it, doing it. It's working great. Cycling, love it, doing it. Cycling is like the easiest of all the situations because we're sitting, we're stable, the torso is fairly stabilized and so forth. So if it doesn't work with cycling, it won't work anywhere, just so we're clear. But then you get over to something like rowing or cross-country skiing where you're doing what's called double poling and you've got a lot of upper body movement, then the signal to noise becomes a problem because it's too noisy. And I think that's going to get solved with algorithmic, approaches. But I think down the road we're moving towards some device, some instrumentation that's going to allow us to be out in the field and measure breathing and heart rate at the same time. And we're going to find out that that's a 1-2 combo that's really useful. And we shouldn't be so surprised that that would be the case because if you ever get wheeled into a hospital unconscious, I can assure you that those are the two variables that the nurses and doctors will immediately go to. Is this person, is their heart beating? And what's the frequency? How's it sound? And are they breathing? And how are they breathing? Those are called vital signs, right? Well, I think they're vital also in the training arena.
And since you began this investigation, what are the biggest learnings? And then how are you applying that in your training and how can everyone?
Yeah. Well, what I've discovered, because I started working with a company, I don't know if I don't know if I want to try to sell this. I try to be neutral. I don't have any economic alignment with this company, but they're based in Boston and they're doing a great job as engineers of trying to solve these issues. And what we found, I've been allowed to test out these devices. I started with myself and then I moved into the lab and then eventually to a couple of cycling teams. Now Visma is using their device. And what do we see is that what I discovered is that if I took heart rate, one of the ways you can kind of make heart rate comparable across people is to use what's called the Karvonen formula. Karvonen was a scientist in Finland. It's a simple idea. It just says take your maximum heart rate and then subtract your resting heart rate, and what you have is then what's called your heart rate reserve. So like if my max heart rate is 170 and my resting heart rate is 40, then I've got 130 beats to work with, right? And every 13 beats represents 10% of my reserve. And so heart rate, the percentage of heart rate reserve correlates quite well with what percentage of your oxygen, your maximum oxygen consumption you are working at. So it's a way of calibrating. And it takes into account the fact that we all have different resting heart rates, we have different max heart rates, but what matters is how many beats do I have to work with, right? Okay. Well, then you can do that with heart rate, but you can also do it with breathing. Because it turns out breathing is quite similar in the sense that we have a resting breathing frequency. Now, the problem with measuring breathing is if you think about your breathing, you almost automatically change it. So it's kind of problematic to have people do resting breathing tests because unless you distract them and they just start doing other stuff, they're going to be thinking about their breathing and they'll almost always slow it down when they do. Yes, yeah. Uh, so as long as they're thinking about it, so what do? We either distract them or we just take a clinical average, like 15 breaths per minute. But what really is interesting is the upper end. What is their maximum breathing frequency? And that, just like heart rate, is variable. People are different. Some people will have a maximum breathing frequency of 55 breaths per minute. Others we've seen as high as 85, 90 breaths per minute at peak. I mean, they're breathing like a rabbit. But it's their signature. And so if we know the heart rate signature or the heart rate reserve and the breathing rate reserve, then what I discovered was during workouts, during either, like a long, it could be any kind of workout. It could be long, and if it's long enough at low intensity or during threshold sessions or during interval sessions, what we see is that when the athlete is starting to struggle, when they're mobilizing more and more to hold the pace that they desire, the power that they're trying, when they start struggling, they start having to mobilize more and more to achieve that desired pace. What we see is heart rate stays stable because heart rate doesn't care how much you're suffering. It just cares about what's the oxygen demand. But breathing seems to be partially regulated by the effort. So that when the brain is having to mobilize more, the brain is having to send more signals to turn on more muscle, it is also turning on breathing frequency. It's turning up breathing frequency. And this research has been developed by a group in Rome that's done some amazing work on how is the brain actually regulating breathing. So breathing frequency is kind of like an effort indicator. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. The first thing that I think of is because, as you mentioned, if you have someone in a clinical setting and you're trying to get a baseline, as soon as they become aware they're being observed, something potentially changes and it alters the manner in which they're breathing. And then at the high end of this, if an athlete, as you said, just naturally, they're going to have a natural upper limit to their breathing rate. Are they able to influence through their perception of the intensity of what's happening? I'm just wondering if there's something that actually can happen in the brain that then can govern the breathing rate or the perception of the intensity that alters the breathing rate.
You can. What I've found and what we've seen is there's so many interesting things about this. Number one, you can try to slow down your breathing, but it's not gonna be sustainable. That forced slowdown is not going to be something that you can just easily do. It's a stopgap measure. The other issue with breathing that's fascinating is that breathing ends up being connected to movement patterns in interesting ways. So we have this term called entrainment or motor respiratory coupling, meaning that I don't know if you said you're not a great runner, but when I started running again after a lot of cycling, I found that my breathing frequency was totally dialed in to my running cadence. Not not one for one, but in multiple. So, for example, I had what you might call breathing gears. So I would start out, if it was really easy, I might be in 3 steps on the inspiration and 3 steps on the expiration. And then once and maybe I'm running downhill, and then I get on a flat, but it's easy. I'm at low intensity. Then it might be 2-3. 2 steps on the inspiration, 3 steps on the expire, and then 2-2, and then 1-2. You with me? So I found that I had these quantum gears, and it would just happen, boom, that it would just step change, right? It wasn't something I was controlling mentally. I could kind of observe it. It was like part of my brain could notice what another part of my brain was doing, but these step changes were automatic. You with me? So it seems that the brain is optimizing or doing some kind of maneuver that is connecting movement cadence, breathing frequency, and then the force of each step or each stride or each stroke. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because those are kind of those three end up being integrated in some way often. You got me? And we see it in rowing, we see it in running, we see it in cross-country skiing. Cycling, not so much, unless you get up off the bike, off the seat, and you got a high torque. You're pushing 600-700 watts trying to get up a hill. Then towards the end of a race, you're letting out what you got left. Then the breathing frequency will zoom in on the movement cadence. So if you're pushing 80 strokes per minute or 80, a cadence of 80, you'll breathe at 80, but it won't be sustainable. It'll be literally a last gasp as you're trying to empty the tank. But for the most part, cycling, we don't see that coupling where the frequency dials into the movement because you just don't have, I don't know, maybe you don't have the demand on stabilization. But with rowing, with running, with cross-country skiing, we see much more that the movement and the breathing, they connect. And I think it's an optimization issue, that the brain is actually trying to use efficiency as kind of the goal. And how do and I've got to often in movement situations, I have to use some of the same muscles to stabilize the upper body as I do to breathe. And so that becomes a challenge, because then you've got to do two things with the same muscles, and you got to figure out, how do I do that? And that's breathe. Then that's when the optimization happens. You start in training on cadence and things like that to help us achieve that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You used the term breathing out of your ears a minute ago. And when I think about the extreme end of the breathing continuum, as you mentioned, things like you're finishing a race, you're sprinting. I think about being in the garage, which is under my office, and finishing a Zwift race, like you almost want to collapse. And if I have headphones on in those moments, they have to come off, or in particular, if it's earbuds, like I just can't have anything touching me at all. Yeah. So to take this from the research realm into the world of practical application, and again, I would love to kind of discuss this dichotomy between, hey, this is what we read about what Tadej Pogacar does, versus, hey, I'm a master's athlete. I have a high stress job. I have a family. Maybe a kid refused to go to school this morning, and I just got an unexpected bill, and I have 8 hours to train this week. How should I be thinking about this?
Right. Yeah. Here's what I would say. Number one, it's really scary and really dangerous to try to adapt training methods that the best in the world are doing, because one of the reasons they're best in the world is they're freaky. Their physiology is not normal, and probably their whole life is not normal. Let's take like Jakob Ingebrigtsen, if you've heard of the runner from Norway that's got quite a few world records, and he's become kind of the poster child for double thresholds, right? And there's good reasons for him to do that kind of approach. But it's important to understand that he's been doing interval sessions since he was 10 years old. He's been building his capacity and his tolerance for really heavy loads for his whole life. And so if I or my daughter, who did this when she went to Oslo and joined the club, if they start to suddenly try to adopt the Jakobsen method, what they generally do is get hurt. They get overtrained, they get injured. And so that's the first thing is you can be inspired by the elite performers, but please don't try to copy what they do. There's a reason they're elite, and they're not normal. And there's multiple reasons. So but we can be inspired in certain ways. And when I think about helping people to create a sustainable process, because that's what we learn from the elite performers, is something that, I know sustainability is a tired phrase, but it is definitely relevant in the training process. And when we talk and journalists like you ask questions to athletes on the podium, what was the key to your success? You don't ever hear them say, well, it was the epic workout I did 12 days ago. Not once have I ever heard that. But what they do say is, well, I had a 6-month run, a period with very little sickness or injury. I was able to string together a period where I just was able to train and get the work done, and good things happened. That's the typical response because it's true. And so now let's think about us as age groupers. I want to build a sustainable program for my athletes, my age group athletes. So what am I going to start with? I'm going to start with frequency. At the base of this little pyramid we're going to build together. And I'm going to say, hey, given your life situation, how many days a week do you think it's reasonable to expect that you're going to be able to train? You're going to be able to get out the door with your running shoes on or get up to your training room. You get me, right? Is it 3 days a week? Is it 4? Is it 5? Give me a number. But when you give me that number, it's a contract, right? We're going to agree on that. So don't overpromise because it's not good for you. It's not good for me. And then they say, well, I'm the coach of my son's soccer team. I've got a tough, I have a leadership position and da. To be honest, I don't think I can do more than 3 days a week. Okay. That's good. That's honest. Let's start there. You with me? And so that's the first thing I'm going to start is, but be true to that. I need you to get out the door every one of those 3 days each week. That's your contract with yourself. And so then after 6-8 weeks, I'm going to say, how are we doing? And hopefully they say, well, I'm doing it. It's getting there. I was not training. I was super irregular, but now I'm becoming very consistent around 3 days a week. And if I miss a day, I miss it. It feels bad to miss. I say, perfect. We've got that healthy addiction going. All right, let's go to phase 2. Now, what are you doing when you get out the door? Well, 45 minutes maybe, run around the block. I say, okay, not bad. But let's start now thinking maybe at least one of those 3 days, let's use duration more effectively. Let's try to stretch it. How much? Well, let's get to 60 minutes first, and then we'll go from there. So now we're using duration. Not high intensity, but we're starting to use that lever or that signaling advantage that we get from extending the duration of work. And it does help. More volume helps accelerate the adaptive process. Okay, so frequency and then duration. And once that's starting to happen and they're able to tolerate some longer sessions at whatever frequency they are at, the icing on the cake is intensity. Now I've got an athlete with a platform, with a base, and we've been working on this for, I don't know, maybe 16 weeks without thinking about a lot of intensity. And now I can say, you know what, now I think you're ready to insert some intensity in the form of some intervals. Now, what I just described to you comes from elite athletes. That's their process: frequency, duration, and then intensity. So that's what, if you want the secret of the elite performer, I just described it to you. The only difference is they're not at 3 days a week. They may be at 12 sessions a week, but they didn't start there. You with me? But frequency is one of the conserved, that's protected. They've got to be able to stay healthy enough to tolerate the frequency before they can start thinking about length, duration. And then once they got that, now they have a base to tolerate and thrive with the application of some of those interval sessions. But it won't be every day. It may be 2 times a week. It might be 1 time a week, but they'll insert some high intensity work. And that's that little pyramid. Unfortunately, for a lot of our listeners, the marketing is the opposite, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The YouTube video focus is not on the pyramid base, it's on the epic workouts.
Right. Yeah, so much is running through my head right now. As somebody who's been sick most of the last 3 months, and I've got young kids, they're 7 and 9. I've had a fair amount of travel, work, and training related to get away from a very cold winter here in Maine. And what I've experienced is, and I think this is the case for a lot of highly motivated people who genuinely actually love endurance sports. Like, I think I love training probably more than I love racing. So maybe that says that I'm a sick person, but there aren't a lot of things in life where when you put a quarter in the machine, you can get $10 out. And I feel like training is like that. Equally, going back to this question of life load, allostatic load, when you have a high level of stress, and you mentioned travel, that you had frequent travel that's perhaps in relation to the AFib that you're experiencing now. But I think for people as they age with high stress, if you take stress and multiply it by travel, for me at least, the result is almost always illness. And I don't know whether that's exposure to just a huge number of humans and different potential exposures to infections while you're traveling, airborne and surface, whatever, or if it has to do with just being cramped and in an unnatural position for long periods of time on a plane, which I also think is really unhealthy. But maybe the foundation of the foundation is actually don't get injured and don't get sick, or you're never going to get to that frequency phase of training. And you also have to resist what can actually be fun if you're someone who enjoys this, which is jumping into a Zwift race or going on a group ride. Or for me, like I like doing VO2 intervals, but you can't be doing that if the stress is super high everywhere else, or you're going to break.
Yeah. Well, you said something about fun, and I say to you that when I have spoken with elite performers, and I mean the best of the best, Kylian Jornet, interviewed him, Niels van der Poel, two world records and 2 gold medals in speed skating, and described his process. They all talk about joy. They all talk about that the key to all of this is enjoying the process, the training process. Tim de Klerk, recently retired, but he was the guy for Soudal Quick Step that could just lead the train, and the breakaway, keep the breakaway under control so that his team would be able to sprint at the end and win, back when they were the wolf pack, and pushing 350 watts for 3 hours, and he would talk about it, that he says, look, it's all about process. We were out on, some rides are 5-6 hours. It's in the rain, and what do you get out of it? That espresso at the top of one of the mountains in the middle of the 4-6 hour workout. It makes it all worthwhile. And these small joys, these small aspects of a process that these athletes, they have to enjoy. If they don't, multiple athletes have talked about losing the joy, they've been world record holders. They've been at the top of the heap, and then something happens and they lose that process joy. And if they don't find it back, then their careers are done. So that's basically the message they say, is that the key to all of this is a sustainable, enjoyable process. And you should not feel like if it doesn't hurt, it's not good for me. Wrong. That's just wrong. And elite athletes have understood that. They can't go hard every day, and neither can you, age grouper. I'm sorry, you're not. You may think you can, but you can't. So that's what we can learn from these high performers, is that they're in it for the long game. They understand that endurance it takes time. You take the example, the world record holder in the marathon for women has changed quite a bit because of super shoes, but excuse me, Paula Radcliffe had the world record for 17 years, British runner. And we have case data on her from Andy Jones. Her VO2 max didn't change from the time she was 18 to world record. VO2 max is pretty easy to train. There's not a lot of magic to it. But it took longer for her speed at lactate threshold to reach its peak, and even longer for her running economy to reach the level that would sustain world record performance. So her process took 10 years. It took 10 years from the time she was a talented teenager to the time she breaks the world record and becomes the GOAT for at least a decade. And that's something we need to understand, that even if you are starting out as a runner at 50, you've got some years in you to improve. So give yourself a pat on the back, let the time work. Don't think you're going to solve everything in a 6-week training cycle. Don't push, get into that sustainable rhythm, and good things can happen. That's the message I would say. And where does breathing fit into all this? Where does heart rate and breathing? It is about regulating each workout and knowing when to say stop. That's one of the things we're seeing with this combination of heart rate and breathing rate, is I've called it a mobilization index, is that when the percentage of your breathing rate reserve that you're having to mobilize encroaches, it's the same as the percentage of your heart rate reserve, you're at the end of your rope. You're right at your limit, and there's not much point in going farther, because from there, doing any more is just going to delay your recovery, but it's not going to generate more adaptive signal. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And with what you and researchers are learning about this relationship between breathing and what's actually happening inside the body, is this a replacement for lactate measurement?
Yeah, I mean, well, ventilatory thresholds, we had to back up a little bit. Some of you hear about training zones. The physiology types like me, we tend to speak about 3 zones that are identifiable based on demarcations that we can kind of measure, we can find. So the first one is that first, what's called lactate turn point, or VT1. So you can measure it either with lactate or with ventilation. And those two are connected. There's a reason why you can use either one, because they're related physiologically and metabolically. But that first one is subtle. And it's the trick. I would say it's the most important one. It's that demarcation between talking pace can go straight to the dinner table, heart rate stays stable during the workout. Those are the indicators, right? And also another important one in that zone, that low intensity green zone, is I can be thinking about other stuff. I can be solving a mathematical puzzle in my head, or thinking about my next research project, or what am I going to buy my daughter for Christmas, or whatever, while I'm at 200 watts on the bike, or while I'm at 5 minutes per kilometer running, or whatever it is, right? Because it's easy and my brain is not having to focus. But there comes this point, this demarcation, where things change and we move into the so-called threshold zone. So in a 3-zone model, that's the middle. And that's that zone that's, the intensity goes up, the lactate concentration goes up, but it can restabilize. But we're feeling this now. And we go from something where we could stay there for some hours to something where we're now, we're pretty happy with an hour at that intensity. Now, elite performers, again, it might be 2 hours. But most of us are going to say, threshold, if I can stay there an hour, I'm good, right, in that zone. And heart rate is slowly drifting up. Breathing is slowly drifting up, but we can be there a while. You with me? So that's that threshold zone. And it's demarcated by that first break where ventilation starts to go up, where lactate pops up. And in elite performers, it's really subtle because they've got really good metabolic control. So it might go from 1 millimolar to 1.5. And that's enough of a change that we say, oh, there's that demarcation. And so that's zone 1, green zone, talking pace, all good. Zone 2, yellow zone. Now I'm starting to scan inward. Now my brain I can't pay attention to the conversation. I'm breathing too hard to be able to hold a conversation, number one. And I'm starting to really scan my own body in that threshold zone. So my brain energy shifts inwardly. Does that make sense? So that's then, if I keep pushing and I go over into that red zone, now we're talking those typical interval type intensities, interval workouts. And now time compresses. Now we're counting minutes and then eventually counting seconds, because it's a one-way trip towards voluntary exhaustion, towards not being able to hold that power. You with me? So the scale of time is compressing from zone 1 to zone 2 to zone 3. The focus is intensifying and you're having to become more and more dialed in, So it's cognitively challenging to do those really high intensity workouts, because there's cognitive effort that you have to expend to maintain, because as Jens Volk, the cyclist who's retired, said, shut up, legs. There's a conversation that's happening in a way between brain and body. We're getting signals from the body that say to our brain, or that interpret it in our brain as, hey, stop doing this. Slow down. Life's too short. This hurts. And then our brain is saying, yes, but the goal line is right out in front. I've got this rider. I can catch them. And so this is the war. This is the conversation. And on good days, we win the conversation. We overcome those signals that say, slow down. On bad days, shit, but that conversation is just part of our zeitgeist, part of the way we are as athletes. We need that conversation in our routine, but not every day, because it's really cognitively demanding. It's physiologically demanding. It turns on some stress responses. It also, these heavy, hard workouts influence our immune response, makes us more susceptible to infections. So we are weakened by them, and we need them, but we got to conserve and count and protect. How often do I go there? And it's chess. The really good athletes are playing chess, not checkers. They are thinking long term. They're thinking, where do I need to be in 6 months? There was the famous Tour de France winner, what's his name, Cadel Evans. And the story of Cadel, it was talking in January. They're at a training camp, and the youngsters, the young athletes, are kind of not impressed with how hard Cadel is pushing up the hill intervals. And because he's the main star of the team, and they're talking amongst themselves. You ask him. I'm not going to ask him. No, you ask him. And then finally, one of them says, "Well, okay, I'll ask him. Cadel, mate, why aren't you pushing these intervals?" Well, and then Cadel says, "Well, mate, it's January. I need to be at my best in July. So I'm pacing, I'll be there, but not in January." And so he's pacing the interval session. He's pacing the process. He's pacing the effort, and making sure that it's a process that will take him to where he wants to be at the time he wants to be there. And he doesn't need to be a hero in January, but he needs to be heroic in July, in stage 11. You got me? And so that's his lesson to the youngsters. And it's a lesson that we all learn from, is, hey, you're in the long game here, folks. And you're in the long game from a competitive standpoint, but you're in the long game also from your standpoint of that we all get older. We all slowly deteriorate. And so I want to train for my grandkids. I want to train to be able to do the things, that will allow me to be the the grandfather they think is cool, because I can still move with them. I can still play with them. So, that's how long the game is for me at age 60, is now I'm starting to say, what do I need to do to be a really healthy, strong 70-year-old? And I want to be that for whoever's coming into my life from my children. You got me? So that's long game.
And with everything that you've discussed today, Stephen, as you've described your training, as you've described research, as you've described like this anecdote with Cadel, one of the things that strikes me is that it's the high degree of attunement to interoception, the experiences of what's happening within your body and within your mind, and having an active dialogue. And when we think about training and exercise physiology and how people approach the application of that, racing, competition, training, it seems that so much of it now is focused on what's the magic metric, what's the magic device that I should have to measure the magic metric, and then almost like a dissociated robot, what action should I take based on the data that I'm getting from this dashboard of inputs that I have? What I'm hearing from you, though, is that how we have a relationship with what's happening inside our body and mind seems very primary to navigating any of this.
Yeah, I think years ago, I think there was the term invented was cyborg, was this combination of man and machine. In many ways, our modern sports world, we are becoming cyborgs, in that we are integrating these digital inputs from our watch and our lactate measure and our power meter with our brains. So we're kind of moving in that direction. And I can assure you that elite performers experience this because they are in addition under a testing regime. So their bodies no longer belong to them because they're having to constantly report and be available for random testing and so forth. So this idea of the cyborg is unfortunately more real than it's ever been. But given that, I would say to you that what we find with the elite performers, the best performers, number one is their brain is beautifully calibrated. They are tuned into their bodies. You know, I used to have a colleague. He's retired now, but he used to be working with the national team in rowing in Norway, and he told me, he said it was amazing. Those guys, I could say, "What do you think your lactate is?" And he said, 3.7. And it was 3.9. You know, I mean, they were plus minus 0.2 of a millimole. They were so dialed in, and they could feel where they were at. And he says that was just the way they were. They were calibrated. And so we didn't need to measure lactate every day because they had calibrated their brains. And I guess I would say to all of us that in this cyborg world we live in, where, you know, and I work with technology too, and I want to use some technology. But the most important technology, the most powerful technology I own is still my brain. And it's true for all of us. And so trusting our instincts, trusting our intuitions. My daughter, who would say to me when I was coaching her as a runner, "Papa, maybe, possibly, I need a rest day." Then I would say, if you're asking me the question, then you know the answer because you just want confirmation from me. You know you need a rest day. Yeah, you're right. Okay. So that's, you know, that's often it's hard for athletes to trust their brains when their brain says rest. But we need to trust it. That's what Niels van der Poel learned. That's what the best learn is, hey, rest is one of the levers. Intensity is a lever, duration is a lever, but so is a rest day. And don't be afraid of them, right? And particularly if you have the typical endurance mindset that you love working out. Well, if you love working out, but a part of your brain is saying, hey, I'm tired, I need maybe to recover today, listen to that. Listen to that voice inside your head. You can trust it because you're not lazy, right? You're an overachiever. You want to get out there, but there's a part of your brain that's saying, maybe need a rest day. Zero in on that. That would be my advice to this audience, which will tend to be in the overachieving category, that will tend to want to deny that voice in their head. And you do that at your peril.
I think of that as working in. And I think that that's often the thing that's much harder for people to do because it's super compensation does not happen and you don't see your fitness increase or your performance increase in any domain unless you remove the stress, because that's how you get the expression of everything over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is for this overachieving group that doesn't get paid to perform, that has a real job, that has the children that they are, if they're overachievers, they're often going to also be involved in them with them as coaches or whatever. So they volunteer for stuff, right? Well, that group is going to benefit even more from a rest day. Why? Because not only are they resting physiologically, but they're getting some time. They're freeing up a block of time that allows them to do some of those tasks that are constantly nagging at them, paying bills on the, getting into the bank or whatever it might be, right? So it's a double win. They get recovery for their body and they get some time to get stuff done, which reduces their stress. in their daily life. Win-win.
That's the
So
way to
don't
do it.
underestimate the power of a rest day, you know. And then people say, yeah, but I come back from a rest day and I'm stale and I can't do that interval session. And yes, you can, but you've got to invest in your warm up, and you have to warm up, do a long warm up, and you have to go through the gears in your warm up. Don't just rush into the workout. Yeah, then you won't feel too good. But if you have that good warm up, then you can do a nice interval session after the rest day.
Yeah,
So,
I've found for me that's actually one of the number one things I've had to change to prevent AFib is like I have to do a real warm up
yeah,
every time. And you know how it is. If you have maybe, I don't know, let's say you have a week, you have 6 hours to train. You want the training time to be training. But what I've found is, boy, I better put in that first 15 to 20 minutes, go through all the gears, or it's guaranteed AFib. And that's not very fun, as you're experiencing.
it is absolutely my experience. So there's never been a time when the warm up was not more important for me. It's always important. So listeners, don't think you only need to have it's only for the AFibbers. The warm up matters, and as we get older, number one, as we get older, we need a longer warm up, and then the shorter the race, the longer the warm up needs to be. Because when you're going out full guns in a 20-minute Zwift race, you better have gone through your gears, or you're going to be off the back in the first 5 minutes. You know, so these are basic lessons. Is the value of the warm up is intensified and increased the shorter and the more intense the start is. And now even in the world tour races, you know, they're saying that because, you know, racing and cycling has just gotten crazy. People are trying to break away so early that some of these people that normally have the job of being at the front of the pack and you know, being the domestics, they're warming up before the race starts. Normally, you know, they would spend the first 20 kilometers just kind of noodling around. That doesn't happen anymore, or it happens much more seldom. And so you're seeing pro cyclists that are about to do a 4.5 hour race, they're on a roller warming up, you know, to get ready for that because of the possibility that there will be an early breakaway and that things are going to get crazy from the first, you know, the gun going from the pace car. So, you know, that's the nature of the beast is endurance sports are getting more unpredictable. They're getting more stochastically, you know, that's a fancy word for meaning that the power and pace are variable. It's more TV friendly for the elite performers. So what's that mean again is there's more sharp turns, there's more little steep climbs. And so the idea of even pacing is kind of going out the window in endurance sports because that's boring. It's not TV friendly. You know, TV friendly is just, you know, I started to say an old male expression, but it is full gas from the start. And then, you know, guys like Van der Poel, Mattia Van der Poel are just amazing at their ability to time those 20-second pushes that create little gaps, and all he needs is 2 meters, and all of a sudden it's game over, you know. And that's racing. It's racing on Zwift for the old boy. It's in general that's the trend of endurance sports is they're getting more punchy, more compact courses. It's cheaper, for example, to do road races where you have a criterium loop. Doesn't take as much police cost. It's not as costly for cities. So even in the age group world, we're seeing some changes in the racing that's just pushing it into a more interval kind of oriented race pacing. Does that make sense?
It completely makes sense. And I think, as you pointed out, as everything gets more intense, all the more important to make sure you make space to get appropriate rest, recovery, and to take care of your heart, which I know you need to go to the hospital to do. So I wanted to say thanks for being here today and for a really fantastic conversation.
Well, thank you, and the same to you. So I love the title of the podcast, and I hope those who are listening got something out of it.
Please hit 5 stars and subscribe to Choose the Hard Way everywhere you listen. Thank you to Steven Seiler for taking time to be a part of this conversation. And stay tuned. We've got part 2 with Steven and Shannon Jones coming soon. It's a case study and analysis of practical application of Zone 2 and VO2 max and polarized training for people not coming from an endurance sports background. I think it'll be really interesting if you're a cyclist, runner, triathlete, or swimmer as well. To support this work, please become a paid subscriber to the Choose the Hard Way Substack. You can find that link at HardwayPod on Instagram in the show notes, and you can always go direct at alwaysthehardway.substack.com. Please share this episode with a buddy who knows that hard things build stronger humans who have more fun. And I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.